continuing our series through the book of Daniel, and this morning we're going to be looking at chapter 4, Daniel chapter 4. If you're using the Bibles in the pew, you can turn to page 693 in the Pew Bible. While you're turning there, let me ask you a question this morning. Do you consider yourself to be a proud person? Well, if you're like me, then perhaps you are proud to say with me perhaps, that you're not a proud person. No. If we're honest with ourselves, if we're honest with each other, then we'll admit that we all struggle with pride. Of course, our culture looks at pride a lot differently. Our culture has renamed pride as self-esteem and sees pride as a virtue rather than a vice. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis wrote this. He said, "There is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people, except Christians, ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I am talking of," Lewis writes, "is pride or self-conceit. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind." Pride is a complete anti-God state of mind. Pride goes before the fall, right? Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So says the well-known and oft-quoted passage from Proverbs chapter 16. 1 Peter 5, we read that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Pride is more than a serious problem. It's more than a costly problem. It is a deathly problem. And in Daniel chapter 4, we read about another bad dream that this king that we've been spending some time getting to know, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. We read about the interpretation of that dream once again from Daniel and what happened to him. This story is about one man's journey from pride to humility after experiencing a very great fall. And in Daniel chapter 4, we will see the root of pride, the result of pride, and the redemption from pride. The root of pride, the result of pride, and the redemption of pride. We'll get there in a few moments, but first of all, we need to understand the context of the passage and then get to this bad dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. The events that are recorded for us here in chapter 4 took place probably about 20 years after chapter 3, which we looked at last week. That famous passage that most everyone knows, when God saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three young men from the fiery furnace. In chapter 4, we find ourselves at the peak of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He's king of most of the known world. And in the first few verses of chapter 4, we see this king offering praise to God. Look with me in verses 1 through 3. It says, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation." What happened to this man? What happened to this pagan king who had he had plundered Jerusalem, taken their best and brightest young men to be educated and trained to serve him in his courts? Again, last week we looked at the event where God rescued those three young men from a fiery furnace after Nebuchadnezzar had sentenced them to death. Why? Because they wouldn't bow down and worship an idol that was made in his own image. What changed? This change that we read about as Nebuchadnezzar sort of has this doxology, before praising God, before he tells his story, his dream, there was a change that happened. And this change was not simply because Nebuchadnezzar had witnessed the power of God as an observer. Again, we've been going through the first few chapters of Daniel, and we see that though he did not believe earlier, he knew about who the God of Israel was. He knew about who the true God was, and there are plenty of people who know about God, but knowledge does not equal faith. God is not a God to be studied. He is a God to be known. James chapter 2, verse 19 says, "You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe, and they shudder." Again, knowing about God does not make you a follower of God. God doesn't simply want you to know about him. He wants you to know him. As one writer put it, miraculous demonstrations of God's power can certainly stop people in their tracks and get their attention, make them think. But true conversion can only be accomplished by a personal experience of God's power and grace. And we have a testimony of a personal experience here in Daniel chapter 4, which brings us to this dream. So let's look at this long bit of narrative here as we look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In verse 4, he says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace." He's at ease and he's prospering. And then he says, "I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretations. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, Chop down the tree, and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, O Belshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. But you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. We'll take a break there for a second. Just like the dream that was recorded for us in Daniel 2, which was about a statue, here in Daniel 4 we have a tree, and these dreams terrified Nebuchadnezzar. And once again, none of the wise men in the kingdom could interpret his dream, so he asked Daniel to interpret it for him. This dream where he saw an enormous tree, a strong tree, that reached all the way to heaven and could be seen by the entire world. The leaves and branches were beautiful, and they were plentiful, he says. And they provided shade and shelter for all the animals of the earth, and the tree produced enough fruit to provide food for everyone. And then he says there was a holy figure that shows up in his dream and comes down and orders that this tree be cut down. Branches and leaves and fruit be scattered, and the only thing left will be a stump. We pick back up with Daniel's interpretation of the dream there in verse 19, where Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while. As Nebuchadnezzar asked for his interpretation of this dream, Daniel goes just completely white and pale. His thoughts alarmed him, it says. The king answered and says, Belshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong so that its top reached to the heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and by your iniquities, by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may be perhaps a lengthening of your prosperity. Now, before we get to the reason for this dream, notice first Daniel's response. Notice Daniel's response to this dream. Daniel had compassion on this man. He had compassion on the king who had sacked Jerusalem, had taken he and his friends captive. He didn't wish evil on the king, but instead he wanted him to experience God's blessing. In revealing the meaning of the dream, Daniel warned him. He said, break off your sins, practice righteousness, your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, and perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. Daniel's initial response to this dream is striking. Oh, that we would be so concerned for those who hurt us and for those who have sinned against God. But Nebuchadnezzar did not listen to the warning. He did not heed Daniel's warning given to him by God in his dream. Again, to have a big picture of what's going on here, Nebuchadnezzar is at the peak of his reign as king of Babylon, one of the most impressive kingdoms throughout all of history. He had plundered Egypt. He had plundered Israel, and he had plundered other surrounding nations and brought their treasures into his own kingdom and filled his kingdom with them, which is in modern-day Iraq. He built one of the wonders of the ancient world. Some of you have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He built those. It was these massive series of tiered gardens made of mud bricks. And from the roof of his palace, he could see all of this. He could see the 50-plus temples to his gods that he had built. He could see most of his city, which was surrounded by a moat and two double-walled systems for protection. An outer wall is 25 feet thick, an inner wall 23 feet thick, and watchtowers all along for protection. One of the walls stretched 17 miles long and was wide enough for a chariot to pass over it. The height of the walls is not really known to us, but the main gate was 40 feet high. An imposing city, a fortified city, an imposing structure for anyone trying to come into it. Babylon, again, was one of the most magnificent cities, impressive cities in the history of the world. And in verses 28 and 30, we read this. All this, the dream, interpretation of the dream, all this came upon Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty?" So after hearing the dream and Daniel's interpretation of the dream, we see what lies at the root of pride. The root of pride. A whole year had passed since he had had this dream. And perhaps, probably like most of us, even a horrible dream like he had, well, we forget them. And so a year has passed, and he's walking on the roof of the palace, and again he says to himself, "Look at this. Look at what I did, by my power and for my glory." The statement shows the very root of pride in the life of Nebuchadnezzar and in our own lives. This is what pride is. It's looking around at who we are and what we have and claiming that we made it all happen. Think of it this way. Think of the best Christmas present that you ever received. What was it? I remember as a small child one year getting a really, really cool train set for Christmas. Some of you received a train set at some point. I see some smiles, but remember how you reacted when you saw that gift. See, pride would have been me going up to this train set and saying, "Look what I did." I didn't do anything. I didn't build the train. I didn't make the train. I didn't purchase the train, and I certainly didn't deserve the train. It was a gift. All I did, all we do when we receive gifts is that. We simply receive them. And this is an illustration of what pride is. Pride is when something is given to you and you claim that you did it. You produced it. Look at what I did by my own power and for my own glory, to use Nebuchadnezzar's words. And one might say, yeah, well, he was king of one of the most greatest kingdoms in the history of the world. I don't behave like a proud, spoiled king. However, we know that not to be the case. And as one writer correctly points out, everyone has within him the soul of a king, not wishing to give way to another, but rather a desire to claim all things for himself. We may not view ourselves as kings and queens, but we often act like it. And our culture certainly encourages this behavior. Remember the old "get it your way, right away" at Burger King now slogan? In 2022, they changed their slogan to simply "you rule." Most people don't remember the original ad campaign that came out in 1974. I don't remember it either, but I read about it. The ad said this. The original slogan was this: "Have it your way." And the subscript below the slogan was this. It said, quote, "You have the right to have what you want, exactly when you want it. Because on the menu of life, you are today's special, and tomorrow's, and the day after that. And, well, you get the drift. Yes, that's right. We may be the king, but you, my friend, are the almighty ruler." Makes you want to buy a cheeseburger, I think. It's interesting how our culture, on one hand, encourages pride. You're in control. And on the other hand, despises it when it sees those who act prideful. Think of politicians or popular culture. They tell us to aspire to these things, right? And then they're despised by them. We act as if we're all kings and queens who only answer to ourselves, and we're busy accumulating things for our own little kingdoms. We get surprised when our kingdoms collide with one another. How dare you bump up against my kingdom? I built this, I did this, and that is what pride is, claiming to have built something that was given to you. Think about your relationships, your family, your friendships, your finances, your job, your possessions. What do you have? What do we really have that wasn't given to us? You may say, well, wait a minute. God didn't put in the time, I did. I punched the clock. I made the connections. I made the wise investments. I worked ethically at my job when others didn't. I did it, and therefore I deserve all that I have achieved. And that's exactly what pride sounds like. And we've all had that in us at some point. The reality is that every day, God is the one who has given you the gift of breath and the gift of creativity. God is the one who has given you the gift of friendships and opportunities. God is the one who has given you the gift of strength to get out of bed and go to work, and the wisdom to make wise decisions. Without these gifts, we would be nothing and we would have nothing. And recognizing that everything is a gift from God is the opposite of pride. It's another word that we throw around a lot. It's humility. It's what humility is. Humility understands that all that we have and all that we are is a gift. And there is a false sense of humility, right? There's a false sense of humility that says, well, I don't deserve this, so I don't want it. That's just really another way of pride. Because if we say that, I don't deserve it, so I don't want it, what we're saying is that you don't really deserve it because you haven't earned it. And that you don't want something unless you have earned it. So there is a false humility, but true humility is recognizing, again, that everything that we are, everything that we have, is a gift from God. Humility is when we understand that if we really got what we deserved in life, on our own power and our own strength, it would be disappointment and judgment. Humility is understanding and recognizing that all we have is a gift and it can be lost in a moment. It's understanding that we are dependent upon God for our lives, including the breath that is keeping us alive right now in this place. Pride says, look at what I did in my own power and for my own glory. And humility looks at what you've been given, what we've been given by the power of God and for his glory. Pride or self-conceit is also strangely competitive in nature. Again, in his chapter on pride in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis writes, "We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better-looking than others. If someone else became equally rich or clever or good-looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone," he says. So pride has a competitive nature about it. Unfortunately, in the church, we often see this competitive nature of pride raise its ugly head in the form of spiritual pride or self-righteousness. What I mean by that is the pride that one can have against other sins. You know the attitude that I'm speaking of. And perhaps you've heard it from others, or you've seen it in your own heart, or you've spoken it from your own mouth. It goes something like this. Well, I've made my mistakes. Nobody's perfect, but I've never done what he did or what she did. I don't do that. In other words, I mean, I'm bad, but I'm not that bad. Jesus has something to say about that from a familiar passage in Luke's gospel. He tells a parable. It says that he told them a parable about who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. About two men who went up into the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed this: "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, the unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." That guy over there. "I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And then Jesus said this. He said, "I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted." There is no place for pride in the church of Jesus Christ. Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, he says, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. So we've seen that the root of pride is all about self-achievement, self-preservation, self-righteousness. The root of pride is centered on self. In the next few verses, in verses 31 through 33, if you follow along with me there in chapter 4, we see the result of pride. There we read, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. What is the result of pride? The result of pride is the very destruction of our humanity. Pride destroys our humanity. It strips away how God made us as dependent creatures upon Him. Humility recognizes our dependence on God, but pride is a declaration that I don't need and I don't want God. And for this king, for King Nebuchadnezzar, the result of his pride meant that his humanity was destroyed. Literally, in his case. He was turned into an animal-like being. He lost his mind. He lost his mind. He was cast out. He lost his power and his position in Babylon, and he lost his humanity. He was living as a beast in the field, eating grass. And he was there for so long that it says that his hair grew as long as eagle feathers, and his nails were long like bird's claws. Now, I didn't do any math or measurements on that, but he was there for a long time, living as a beast in the field. God shows us through this story, through Nebuchadnezzar, that by desiring to be more than human, by desiring to be on the same level as God, look what I've done, my power, my glory, we actually, in turn, become less human. We, human beings, were created to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, to make much of Him and enjoy fellowship with Him. That's what it means to be human. But in our pride and in our sin, we become self-centered, self-gratifying, animal-like beings who are far from God. Pride strips away our humanity. It's that dangerous. It's that destructive. So if that is the case, if pride destroys our humanity, it seems like it should be something that we should be looking for in ourselves as individuals, that we should be looking for, on the lookout for, as it were, in our families and in our church family, to be on the alert. What does pride look like? How does it creep in? I would offer, just for us to think about this practically, 7 ways that we can be on the lookout for pride in our lives. They are when we are unwilling to acknowledge, admit, ask, laugh, learn, listen, or serve. It's a long list. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think it would be helpful as we think about self-evaluation. And here it goes again. Are you willing to acknowledge your weaknesses? Are you unwilling to acknowledge your weaknesses? Secondly, are you unwilling to admit when you are wrong? Who's with me? Thirdly, are you unwilling to ask others for help? Number 4, are you unwilling to laugh at yourself? Are you unwilling to learn from others? Are you unwilling to listen to others? And lastly, are you unwilling to serve others? Seven questions. Perhaps we can ask ourselves to help us identify where pride may be present in our lives. Perhaps questions you should ask your spouse or child or friend. These questions about yourself. For example, am I unwilling to admit when I am wrong? And be quiet and wait for the answer. Or Do I really listen to you? Some of you are looking around. This exercise is for later. Spiritual growth, see, it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community. And so I hope that God will help us. We need to be identifying where pride may be creeping into our hearts. And by God's help, to kill it by the power of the gospel. Before it strips away at our humanity, hurts our relationships, and possibly destroys us. The result of pride. In the final verses of chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar's redemption from pride. His redemption from pride. Ultimately, God showed mercy to this king. Psalm 103, verses 9 through 11 says, God will not always chide, nor will he keep his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. God had judged Nebuchadnezzar, but he had shown his mercy to him through this time of living, literally, as a beast of the field. We don't know exactly how long it was. Scholars say 7 months, perhaps 7 years. The text is vague. It says 7 periods of time. You know, the number 7 in Scripture is a number of completion. It's a number of perfection. And we see that basically God had laid out this process for Nebuchadnezzar, and he would bring it to completion. But God could have simply wiped him out. He does that in the history of the world. We've already seen him tell Nebuchadnezzar this earlier in Daniel. Daniel declares God is the one who raises kings and puts them down. But he didn't just wipe Nebuchadnezzar out. He was gracious to him. And in return, Nebuchadnezzar did 3 things. And let's look at those briefly as we close. The first thing that Nebuchadnezzar did was confess his dependence upon God. He confessed his dependence on God. In verse 34, it says, at the end of the days, these days, this period, whether 7 months or 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. It says he lifted his eyes to heaven. He took his eyes off of himself and lifted them to heaven in acknowledging his dependence on God. Where are we looking in our day-to-day lives? It's often so easy to be just looking at what is around us and what we think that we have control over. Are you trying to live your life apart and independent from God? Or do you recognize your desperate dependence on God? Nebuchadnezzar confessed his dependence upon God. The second thing that he did was confess the sovereignty of God. Look back at the end of verse 34 and following, where he says, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand, and none can say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, he says, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and my splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Nebuchadnezzar was restored, but that's not the point here, is that he recognized God's sovereignty over all earthly kingdoms, including his own. Though it was massive in the comparing God's kingdom, it was small. Are you busy building your own earthly kingdom? Or do you recognize God's sovereign claim and control over everything that you are and everything that you have? Nebuchadnezzar confessed the sovereignty of God. The third and last thing that he did was confess the goodness of God. He confessed the goodness of God. Verse 37 says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." Nebuchadnezzar declared that God is good. We sing something like that, usually, every week, declaring the goodness of God. Do we believe it? Do you get angry or bitter with God when things don't go the way that you think that they should? Most of us do at times. Life is filled with celebrations on top of the mountains, and also filled with hardships in the depths of the valleys of life. Only those who've been humbled by God can say, "I know and I believe that God is right all the time, that he's just, that he's good. He is good because he walks with us all the way." I hope that you can say that this morning. And whether you can or whether you cannot, I would ask for you to consider the life of another king. There is a king who could look out, not simply over an earthly kingdom, but over the entire creation, and say, "Look at what I built by my mighty power and for my mighty glory." But instead of exalting himself, this king humbled himself. Though in the very nature of God, he took on flesh like us. He left the beauty of the heavenly places to live on this dirty planet that we call home. This king was a homeless man that barely owned a thing. This king was a preacher who proclaimed the coming of the kingdom of God, a kingdom that will only advance and will never fail. This king was a servant who healed the sick, and he washed his disciples' feet. This king was innocent but was sentenced to death like a criminal. This king, King Jesus, died on a cross in our place, in the place of proud sinners like you and me. He was crucified and he was resurrected in order to redeem us from our pride and in order to restore us in relationship with God. For our sake, Paul writes, he made him, God the Father, made him, Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Like Nebuchadnezzar, we must look away from ourselves and look up to God. We must look away from our accomplishments, our achievements, our successes. We must turn away from the destructive disasters that we've brought about in our own lives, or that others have brought about in our own lives from sinful pride. We must recognize that all that we have, and all that we are is a gift. And gifts are simply to be received and shared. We must look to the one true King, King Jesus, for his forgiveness and restoration. The only thing that we bring, the only thing that we have to offer is brokenness and our need for him. And thankfully, that is all that he requires. For Jesus is the great sovereign and merciful King. He can do the rest. He's already done it through his life and death and his resurrection. Thanks be to God.